belts applies to both shakers. After having a belt broke or removing a belt, you would have the weight shafts, which I'm rocking in my hand now, simply freewheeling. And to keep the weight from freewheeling, to allow you to install the belt, you take a 3-inch or 2.5 or inch 3/8 bolt, insert it through the center hole into the box. The weight is threaded 3/8 coarse thread so that the weight can be held still while you're installing new belts. After installing the first belt, you would then install the first bolt. Then you refer to the other end of the box and do the very same thing with the other belt, or with the other weight, excuse me. Simply insert the bolt through the box into the weight, keeping in mind that each weight weighs 85 pounds. Simply hand tightening the bolt is not sufficient. You need to run the bolt in at least 3 to 5 threads to keep the weight from swinging. Once your bolts are installed, then you attempt to take the belt and work it over the pulley, not to damage the edge of the pulley or the belt. If an attempt to put the new belt on, as I have, it does not immediately slide over the edge, do not pry or force the flange on the edge of the pulley. This flange is not welded, it is just simply pressed upon the pulley. You would need to push the pulley down closer to the center pulley so that the belt could be easily slid over the flange. Once the belt is on the pulley, you would attempt to visually line the belt so that when you attempt to tighten it, that you do not have a side draft on the belt. After the belt's installed, refer back to your tightener. In an attempt to make the job quicker, you want to make sure that there's the equal amount of slack on both sides of the belt. If you have the belt off one tooth, you would have an enormous amount of slack on one side of the belt and very little on the other side. Okay. After achieving that, you go back to the tightening bolt and draw the belt taut. When the belt is sufficiently tightened, you'll be able to turn the belt 1/4 turn on both sides of the belt. If the belt is exceedingly loose on one side and taut on the other, the shaker is then out of time and will not shake correctly and will cause damage to the bearings and to the weight box. After both belts are in and tight, you've gotten to the point that you're fairly certain it's timed. All 4 sides turn 1/4 turn. Both of the bolts that you have installed in the center of the box are loose. The next thing that we need to know is if the belts that we have installed, are they true to the center pulley? If the belt is not perfectly aligned, if the outer pulley is not in line with the inner pulley, the belt will ride to one side of the pulley or the other and prematurely wear out the belt and the pulley. After you're convinced that you've got the timing correct, you remove the bolts in the center. and spin the weights gently in the direction that they turn. Okay, after turning the belt I've just installed has ridden to the furthest point outside on the pulley. To correct that, I'll use a straight edge to help me align the belt. By laying a straight edge along the face of the pulley, I can now determine how far off I am by measuring the gap between the closest and the furthest point. I recognize that my belt is closer at the furthest point than it is at the closest point. So by that, I need to tilt the pulley accordingly. This has only given me a rough idea as to where I'm at. Okay, to finally finish what I'm about to do, I will keep gently spinning the belt, keeping my hands away from the teeth, the open side of the pulley, so not to get pinched. Right now I'm simply pushing the back of the weight shaft down to correct the misalignment of the belt. Once I have achieved a slight air gap on both sides of the belt, I know then that I have the belt and the shaft all running true. Now the belt may vary a slight degree back and forth, so long as the belt does not scuff or rub either side of the pulley, you are correct in having it aligned. After having the belt aligned, you would tighten the jam nuts on your tensioners so that it cannot move to finish the process. Once your jam nuts are tightened, you double check yourself to make certain that the belt does stay in the center of the pulley. As I have just done, the belt head has moved, so I will have to go back and readjust my jam nuts. And this often happens when installing it because of the hurried rush that we think we need to be in. Okay, keeping in mind when moving the shaft back and forth in the box, that in pushing the back of the shaft down, you may over-tighten the belt, as I have just done. It's very difficult to turn that belt a quarter turn. So then I would go back and loosen the front bearing, allowing the shaft to drop a small amount, and then turning it again. Keeping in mind, you do not want to spin this any faster than you can maintain it. You're spinning approximately 160 pounds of weight, keeping your hands free of the weight as it turns. Now that I have loosened this side, the belt has returned to center of the pulley. So I'll then go back and retighten the jam nut. Okay, now that I've got the belt centered, I'll double check myself again. Once I'm certain that both of my belts are running true, making certain that they're not scuffing each other in the center. If your pulleys are not correctly aligned on the shaft, your belts may touch or rub or scuff each other on the center pulley. In that situation, you would need to loosen the pulley up and realign it and go back through the process that I just showed you. Once you're certain that everything is in the place that you think it needs to be, and you're comfortable that it freely turns by hand with no obstruction, you then would go back and tighten the bolts holding the bearings and the bearing holders, turning each bolt an equal amount on one side of the box, changing side of the box and turning the bolt the same distance. By doing this, you're achieving and equal, so that one side of the box is not tighter than the other. Once all of the bolts are equally tightened, because the holes in the box are slotted, and you may have moved the bearing in the position to the box, you then come back and double check to make certain that the belt you've just installed is centered on the pulley again. If it is not, you may need to loosen the bolts and realign it with the tightening bolts again. If everything has stayed in place, you're finished with that portion of it. You would then lock the bearing collars on the shaft. And you always lock the bearing collar with the rotation of the shaft. In both of our shakers, the shaft turns towards the back of the machine. If you keep in mind the path of the fruit through the machine, when you're doing this, it'll help in keeping in mind that the fruit travels over the top and out the back, and that's the same way that the shaft turns. That'll help you keep reference as to which way everything goes. Once you've got the collars locked, you then lock the set screws in the bearing collar. Okay. Then you've completed timing, tightening, and aligning the shaker belts. Certain that you have everything tight and aligned, you then go back and double check to make absolutely certain that the shaker is in time. Because of all of the adjustments that you've just made, you may have, something may have moved on you and you're not realizing it. Install 1 3/8 bolt in the end closest to you, turning the box. Reinstall a bolt in the other end. Okay? As I presumed, it is timed. In an event that the shaker is not timed, for example, you could not get the second bolt in, you can, instead of loosening the belts, which you've got everything nice and aligned here, we don't want to go backwards. So what we're going to do, we know we're just a small amount out of adjustment. Okay? We can see the hole, but we can't quite get our bolt started into it. Then we would go to the end of the weight cap, which we'll show you in a moment. You would loosen one bolt and tighten the other to rock the weight around the shaft so that the hole lines up. These bolts are 5/8 grade 8. They need to be tightened extremely tight. Keeping in mind, we're swinging an 85-pound weight up to 450 RPMs. This is something that needs to be double checked when you're done, not to be forgotten. Needs to be checked 24 hours after you've reinstalled. Okay, now I have rotated the shaft approximately 1/8 of an inch to better line up my timing marks. Okay, now I am absolutely certain that both bolts are in. Neither of them are tight in the slots. If the bolts are tight in the slots, you would go back to the end cap and adjust it to which direction that both bolts are loose in the slots. Okay? If that is not achieved, the shaker will be slightly out of time. Probably not enough to damage things, but enough to cause a vibration in the machine that you will notice. So that is something that needs to be paid extra detail to. Once you're certain everything is timed, please go back and check all of the bolts, all of the belts, and the alignment again to make certain that the belts are not going to wear prematurely and that all the bearing bolts are tight. If anything is left loose, you'll have an excessive noise or rattle coming from the box. And there's a very great potential to have some significant damage done to the shaker box. So time is something you need to be very patient and take extra pains to make sure all of this is done correctly. Once it is all aligned, reinstall the end caps to protect the shaker weights, and you're finished.